Good everyone, welcome back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, we've had tourism data come out now for the full 2024 calendar year. Certainly a bit more optimistic at the end of the year when we look at sort of how things have been recovering. Over 2024 in total, 85% recovery of tourism arrivals coming into New Zealand compared to the 2019 year before the pandemic, really started to come through and hit. Found it interesting going through those numbers. We really did have this sort of expectation around the middle of the year that the recovery was effectively plateauing. It really didn't get a lot more momentum going through the middle of the year. It was flat. It was absolutely flat. Then the last sort of 2 months, there was a bit more of a tick up in that recovery. And December, which is one of the bigger months for tourist arrivals into New Zealand, up to 89% of monthly pre-pandemic travel, which again, look, we're not back at 100, but certainly that momentum, a little bit of a shift coming through there, I think is quite encouraging. The government's been talking a big game on the tourism front recently, and we'll probably get back to that in a moment. But at the same time as, look, there might be a little bit more momentum at the end of the year. It wasn't coming from what was previously a pretty important part of our tourism market, and that was China. I mean, just how bad are things?
Yeah, I mean, those Chinese visitor numbers, I think currently sitting at around about 60% of pre-pandemic levels, which is quite a contrast to the 89% that you mentioned when you look across the sector as a whole. And I mean, it is interesting. You've got to remember, if you remember back to 2018, 2019, we were falling from grace a little bit in terms of those China tourism numbers. Anyway, early in 2019, the Chinese government had made comments about maybe New Zealand wasn't quite the sort of hot place that everybody should be going to. And so through the course of that year, there was weakness coming through prior to the pandemic. So big unknown, really, I think, in terms of where those Chinese visitor numbers might sort of sit or stabilise over the medium term, given that historical context. But the reality is they certainly haven't recovered post-COVID to anywhere near the levels that most of the other sort of arrival numbers have done. And again, it's not just a sort of political thing. We know the Chinese economy has been struggling significantly in terms of its official growth numbers, where GDP growth is sitting at around about 5% rather than the double digits that we were used to pre-pandemic. We know the population is shrinking. You've got high youth unemployment. You've got issues with the construction industry and manufacturing activity. None of them are looking particularly positive. So with that broader economic environment, it's not surprising that you're not seeing the growth in or the recovery in Chinese visitor numbers coming back to New Zealand. It had been a massive growth area from about 2012, 2013 through to 2018, but not the same now, to the point where, in fact, Australia is our largest market, but I think China has slipped to a third largest behind America. And I'm not sure how long it's been that America's been up into second place, but it's certainly an area where there has been more welcome recovery coming through.
That's absolutely right. I mean, that US market is really strong now. Our second biggest tourism inflow market has been for the last 2 years. But I think part of that was that sort of curiosity of, look, will China sort of come back in 2024? A bit of a slower start in 23 as they unlocked a little bit later than the rest of the world. But it just hasn't really come through. Like you say, 61% for China. For the US market, it's back at 100%. It's back to what it was before the pandemic hit. And so, there's a real immediate sort of shift that's been coming through there. And you look at the likes of the economy in general in the US, and that sort of describes why you've seen that bounce back. I mean, spending activity is just, going great guns. There is a huge amount of stimulus. From households that's just flowing out not only to the domestic economy in the US, but coming out across the world as well. And obviously in more recent times, you've seen a bit of a shift as well in the exchange rate, which means that if you're an American coming down to New Zealand, geez, you got like a 10% discount going on what you might have originally thought. So all of that helps. And I think interestingly as well, when you look through, some of those American visitors, they really do on a spend basis. Like, it's not just number wise that they're coming through, but when they spend big. I talked to someone recently who said, there was a local area had an influx of tourists. The cafes thought they might sell a few more coffees and scones, but it happened to be Super Bowl day, and these guys just, absolutely ravaged the place until there was sort of nothing left in the cabinet, which is awesome news. But just very different from what we've sort of had before. You also mentioned the Australian market there, a pretty big one, sort of recovering roughly in line with the sort of overall total average, which is again encouraging, but also interesting that the government's obviously focused a lot more on tourism in recent times, seeing it as an area that they can make some sort of shorter term influences. You saw first a bit of a shift around the likes of digital nomad visas and allowing a few more people to come in for longer and sort of, do some work from New Zealand for overseas based companies. To be fair, I don't think that probably changes the numbers much. It probably just legitimizes a few more travelers that were already here, but it has put us on the map. That announcement got featured in CNN and some of the other sort of big media agencies across the world. There's also some stuff that government's doing around, visas, investor visas and similar coming into the country. Not as much on the tourism side, but again, that'll help. But more recently, a $500,000 campaign to attract Australians to come over here to New Zealand. Everyone must go. I think it is, or must, it's one of those things where sometimes you look at the marketing slogans and you go, you can take that a few different ways, but hey, that's what it is for the moment, and an expectation that, for the government, they want to try and spread it out as well. So it's not just coming in the peak seasons when everyone's here, but if we can get a bit more activity through the shoulder seasons and that, there's definitely some potential. The Australians are a slightly different market than a lot of other parts of the world. Often we don't have as many international visitors here in New Zealand during winter time, just because it's a bit colder. And if you're going to explore New Zealand, you often want to do it more in the summer. But of course, the Australians like to come for a ski. And so often there's, again, a bit more of an Australian peak through the winter. So spreading that out a bit more, having a bit more of that activity come over is definitely what the government's trying to focus on. Whether or not it will shift the growth dial is a little bit questioned still. But overall, tourism recovery still coming through, not there yet, and probably not going to be there this calendar year either. It will take a bit of time for some of those numbers to fully come through. And there's all of the overhang of higher interest rates and that around the world. So a lot of sort of moving parts there. We've also seen a pretty high recovery in New Zealanders travelling overseas. I think it was at 98% of pre-pandemic levels or similar. So look, we're still travelling a little bit more as well. Gareth, do you have any travels on the cards internationally this year?
No, it's still too busy with other things to be going off internationally. Maybe next year though. But yeah, I mean, you look at the tourism recovery that you mentioned. I mean, one of the other aspects that stood out to me when I was looking at some other data was just around job numbers, and arts and recreation job numbers still up 3% from a year ago. There's a lot of other industries where job numbers have contracted, but you can see, I think, domestic spending and discretionary spending has obviously been down with the weakness in the New Zealand economy and the recession, cost of living, high interest rates, all that sort of stuff. But you can see the effects of the tourism recovery coming through in that particular sector and outweighing what's been going on domestically as more international people come in. And I think that's reflected in some of the sort of regional growth outcomes as well. And the fact that there's quite a bit of optimism, particularly around Queenstown, other parts of the South Island as well, as those tourist numbers continue to pick back up.
Definitely. And look, we've got some great offerings down there. And hopefully, as we do continue to see that recovery roll through, there will be more people that come and explore the country, which is always exciting. Although perhaps we need to sit down and sort of think about our own travels across the world so we can see more interesting parts of the global economy and bring some of that back to New Zealand too. We'll leave it there for the time being. We'll go and put our travel thinking caps on before we come back, but we'll come back and have a bit more of a review of what happens in the tourism market in the years ahead, what markets recover, which ones maybe don't quite as much, and everything else around those movements on one of our future editions of Econ Talks.